Chapter 7. Jigsaw in Glass. Inside the house, Bess, George, and the Carrs were talking excitedly about the man who had peered in the window. When Anna described his face, Susan was sure he was the masked man who had caused her first automobile accident. "I'll call the police," Cliff said, and went to the phone. Dessert had been forgotten, but suddenly Anna reminded the diners they had not touched their strawberry shortcake. "I'll fix another helping for Mr. Cliff right away," she said. "You all go back to the dining room." It was not until they returned to their places at the table that the group realized Nancy had not joined them. "That's odd," said George. "I saw her come into the house." She went to the foot of the stairs and called to the second floor. There was no answer. Worried, George went up and looked around. Coming down, she remarked, "Nancy must have gone outdoors again to do some sleuthing." "Oh dear," said Susan. "I hope nothing has happened to her." Cliff hurried for a flashlight, and the group went outside. He cast the light around and soon spotted the man's footprints. Figuring that Nancy had trailed him, the others followed the marks and soon found the girl's limp body. "Oh, Nancy!" Bess cried out, terrified. She fell to her knees beside her stricken friend. To Bess's relief, Nancy opened her eyes. She blinked in the glare of the flashlight and mumbled, "Where is the paint tube?" The onlookers glanced at one another. Was Nancy delirious? But a second later, her mind cleared and she sat up. "Something hit me in the back. I fell forward, hit my head, and blacked out," she said, looking around. Pointing to a large stone, she added, "I guess someone threw that at me." "How awful!" Susan exclaimed. Then she told Nancy of her suspicion that the man was the one who had shoved her car off the road. "I think he was an artist," Nancy said. She told them about the black paint tube. "He apparently knocked me out to take it away from me without being seen. Anyhow, it's gone." The Carrs helped Nancy to her feet, and then they all went into the house. Nancy was immediately put to bed. Not only the police, but the Carrs' physician, whom Susan had summoned, arrived in a few minutes. Dr. Tillett, solicitous and efficient, examined Nancy and announced that she had no serious injuries. He predicted that her back would feel sore for several days, but it would not be necessary for her to stay in bed. "Just take it easy tomorrow," he advised. Nancy did not see the police. Cliff had felt it was not necessary, and the officers had agreed. But later, when she was alone with Bess and George, the young sleuth remarked, "The tube of paint was a good clue." "You suspect that Bradshaw or Rugby dropped it?" George asked. "Yes, I do." Nancy said that the next morning she would make a paper model of one or two of the footprints. "Then I'll visit Waverly as soon as I can to see if Bradshaw's shoe fits the print." "Good idea," said George. "But it won't be easy to do." "I know," said Nancy, yawning wearily. "But I'm going to try it." The following morning, Bess and George helped her make the paper footprint. Luckily, the ground was hard enough to permit this. Because of the Carrs' friendship with Bradshaw, the girls did not tell Susan or Cliff what they had in mind. At luncheon, Susan said, "I have an idea. This afternoon we might visit some of the old estates around here. How would you like to see Thomas Jefferson's and James Monroe's homes?" "Oh, we'd love it," Bess replied for all the girls. "And if we have time," Susan went on, "we'll visit some other interesting old places. As we go along, Nancy, you might inquire about the missing stained glass window." Nancy was thrilled to make the trip, and the sightseers set off at once. As they drove along, Susan reminded the others that Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, had served as American minister to France. While there, he had become interested in Roman architecture after viewing famous ruins. When he returned to Virginia, he designed his home, Monticello, in that style. "And he was an inventor, too," Susan remarked. After leaving the car in the visitors' parking lot, the girls walked up to the stately mansion, which stood on a knoll overlooking the rolling Virginia hills. Finally, turning reluctantly away from the lovely view, they went inside the house. There they admired the beautifully proportioned rooms and the many inventions and conveniences Jefferson had installed in his home. One arrangement in particular attracted the girls. This was a bed set in a space between two rooms so that Mr. Jefferson could get out on either side, depending on whether he wanted to be in his dressing room or in his study. During the day, the bed could be drawn into the ceiling to allow free circulation of air between the two rooms. "That's for me!" Bess exclaimed. "You'd never get out on the wrong side of the bed." "Let's go on now to James Monroe's home," Susan suggested. "You'll find it more simple, but the gardens have the most beautiful boxwoods you've ever seen." Back in the car again, they drove up the winding mountain road until they came to Ash Lawn. James Monroe, the 5th President of the United States, had built it here to be near his friend Thomas Jefferson. Susan told them that Ash Lawn was smaller and more informal. A path lined with beautiful boxwood hedges led up to the door. Inside, a mirror hanging on the opposite wall reflected the path, making it appear extremely long. After leaving Ash Lawn, Susan took the girls to 3 other estates. At each one, Nancy inquired whether the owner had heard of any medieval stained glass windows in the area that had a peacock in the design. In each case, the answer was no. "I guess we'll have to give up for today," said Susan, glancing at the car clock. "It's getting late." The girls agreed, and they started home. Susan had driven only 2 miles when she exclaimed, "Why didn't I think of this before?" "Think of what?" Nancy asked. "The Dowds. They live around the next bend. They have a perfectly fascinating home, and Mrs. Dowd knows about everything in the neighborhood. If that window is in any home around the Charlottesville area, she'll know it." "Then let's talk to her," Nancy urged. Susan turned into the winding driveway of the Dowd place and pulled up in front of an austere, white-painted brick mansion. Fortunately, Mrs. Dowd was at home. She greeted Susan effusively. "And bless you, dear, you've brought some very attractive friends," she said. Susan introduced them. Mrs. Dowd, 50-ish, was a great talker, and the girls did not have a chance to say anything. She expressed her delight at meeting the visitors from River Heights and instantly mentioned 2 people she knew there. Mrs. Dowd bubbled along in the one-sided conversation until Susan finally interrupted diplomatically. "Nancy would like to ask you some questions," she requested. "Yes, dear, go ahead," said Mrs. Dowd. "What is it you want to know?" Nancy quickly told her, and to the girls' elation, Mrs. Dowd said, "Well, I declare! Now maybe I can lead you all right to that reward." Her eyes glistened. "You know, up in our attic, piled in one corner, are parts of a stained glass window. It was hanging up once. I admit to being a right lazy individual when it comes to working out puzzles, so I've never tried putting the old thing together." She rose and invited her guests to follow her to the attic. All the way up to the 3rd floor, she kept apologizing about the dust and cobwebs that they would probably find, because it was so difficult to get help these days. "As for myself," said Mrs. Dowd, "I never go near the place." Fortunately, there were bright lights in the attic and a large cleared space in the center. The girls brought the glass sections to this spot and got down on their hands and knees to try figuring out how the pieces would fit to make a picture. Mrs. Dowd became so excited that she helped them. "This is a jigsaw puzzle on a large scale," George remarked. "And just about as hard," Bess added. By the end of an hour, a large section of the window had been put together. Though the picture was not complete, it was evident that the stained glass window did not portray a knight riding a white horse and carrying a shield with a peacock design. Finally, Nancy stood up. "Mrs. Dowd," she said, "you've been a wonderful sport, letting us raid your attic and work on this. Unfortunately, this is not the window we're looking for. Would you like us to put the pieces back where they were?" "Oh, no, indeed," said Mrs. Dowd. "I declare I'm going to finish this if it takes me a year. I've always been curious to know what this little old window was. I'll get my husband to help me finish putting the pieces together." The girls then followed Mrs. Dowd down the stairs. As they said goodbye to her, she wished them luck in finding the right window. The road to Susan's home led directly past the Bradshaw farm. Nancy, who had put the paper model of the footprint in her purse, said, "Susan, if it's not too near dinner time, let's call on Mr. Bradshaw. I'd like to ask him a couple of questions." "All right." Susan turned in at Waverly, saying, "You know, I've been in the Bradshaw home several times, but I've never visited the studio. It will be interesting to see it." As before, the door stood open, and Mr. Bradshaw came to greet his visitors. "Susan!" he cried out in delight. "I'm so glad to see you and your friends." The callers stepped out of the car and walked into the studio. A man of about 40 was standing by the bench under which Nancy had found the copy of Continental. He was short, dark, and had very bright, small eyes. Mr. Bradshaw waved toward the stranger and said to his callers, "I'd like to present my new assistant. He has been with me a week. This is Mr. Alonzo Rugby." End of Chapter 7.